for languages online, like 5 minutes yeah. I'll be trying to time you guys, but for my class, I'm just not going to cover it. So yeah. Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, in the free market of humanity and anthropology, we believe that the creative destruction of culture, of traditions, and of linguistics is necessary and is good. We think that in the interest of creating a broader and more accessible national identity and to allow cultures and societies and indigenous communities to move forward into the new world, we think that it is necessary to allow some culture and some cultural practices to die and to then allow those communities to move onto other cultural practices that are more modern, ladies and gentlemen. Today inside government, we identify 3 fundamental problems in status quo. Firstly, before I get on to that, let me just clarify the parameters of this debate. Firstly, obviously, this debate happens in nations where resources are scarce and where states cannot simply pour money into every single initiative to help communities and minorities, ladies and gentlemen. We're also talking about countries which are obviously multiracial and polyethnic, where the states have an interest to create large national identities and to unify societies and communities that perhaps at one point were in some form of division. So we're talking about nations like Indonesia, like India, ladies and gentlemen, where there are thousands and thousands of languages and communities, and how do we best bring these communities together? Thank you. There are 3 problems in status quo. First, we say that in this instance where governments fund dying languages, we say that it is grossly inefficient spending. We characterize dying languages as languages that are spoken by small minorities of people. Yeah. So in India, we're not talking about preserving Hindi. We're talking about letting the language spoken by the giant community to allow that to die. In Malaysia, we're not talking about preserving the Malay language. We're talking about preserving like indigenous language spoken by Iban or Baksa communities in Borneo, for example. What we say is that in many cases, states are grossly inefficient in using this money, and this money doesn't essentially help these communities in any way. States oftentimes use these preservation efforts as ways to rally up minorities and to pander and posture themselves to these minority groups. We don't think it's a good way to use that money. Secondly, we say that it stops the evolution of culture, which I'll talk about later. And thirdly, we say that it actually creates division within society. No, thank you. Moving on to my argumentation, let me first talk about the evolution of culture and how states' intervention in the free market of language stops this. We say, ladies and gentlemen, that it is essential sometimes for some communities who speak languages to allow those languages to die off in order to access broader, more accessible social avenues. We would say that in many cases, many communities many newer generations in indigenous communities will choose and opt to find more mainstream forms of education in order to allow them to access the greater free market and also the greater social community. So for example, in places like China, we allowed like the Han and the Mongol languages to die off so that China could move forward towards a national identity and to allow the speaking of a national, like Mandarin, Hokkien, and Cantonese, ladies and gentlemen. It was necessary, for example, for indigenous communities in Malaysia to stop speaking their languages and move into the mainstream, speak more mainstream languages. What we say in these cases, when states preserve language, is that they stun those efforts. Because oftentimes, when states preserve dying languages, what they often do is for example, what they can do is that they can make it, for example, a compulsory subject to be taught in schools, or a compulsory passing subject to be taught in schools. So communities, especially indigenous communities, are harmed by this because oftentimes younger generations cannot move away from those communities and access the broader market because they're forced to sit down and learn the language and to oftentimes become ambassadors of those languages at, for example, social conventions or public fairs where they are expected to become the poster faces of these languages. So oftentimes people don't move away but are stagnated in those. Oftentimes as well, we say that sometimes languages evolve and sometimes newer languages sprout out as a result of older languages dying. And these newer languages, for example, like Malay, for example, which is like a concoction of not only Polynesian dialects, but also of Chinese dialect. Oftentimes, newer languages, which are more accessible to larger societies, sprout out because older languages die. And we tell you, states preserve older languages, this cannot happen. On a second level, we would say, my second argument is that These efforts oftentimes otherize communities. As I said earlier, many indigenous groups prefer to allow dying languages to die off and move into mainstream societies because that allows them greater access. Oftentimes, communities are divided and compartmentalized based on the languages and the cultural traditions that they speak and they practice. When they allow these cultures to die off and find newer cultures which are more accessible and to broader society, I think that's when social integration happens best. Look at Singapore, for example. When Singapore has like so many minority groups and having to face all the ethnic tensions in society, Singapore decided to make English the official language and allow other languages to like die off. Yes, they do still speak Chinese and Tamil and Malay, but that's fine. But necessarily English had to become like the unifying language between all of these communities. What oftentimes happens is that when these societies try to move away from that identity that they used to have and try and enter mainstream society, that is harm because states otherize and compartmentalize these communities. But by saying that, well, if you come from this indigenous group, you're expected to be able to speak this language, and this is expectedly your first language, and that harms the ability of these groups to access larger society. Before 6 minutes, any points of view?
So if a national identity is formed up of the oppression and random borders we drew out and decided to colonize people, why is that anti-fair put on everyone?
Because that is the reality in the world today, and that is the only way in which we can unify everybody. We're not saying that colonialism is good, but we're saying that in the world we have today, it is better to perhaps unify everyone and assimilate everyone into a national identity and language rather than allow these social ethnic divisions to ferment. The third thing I want to talk about is the commodification of culture. So oftentimes states have an interest not to necessarily pander to these minorities, but to make these languages as accessible as possible. Otherwise, these preservation efforts will fail. So oftentimes these languages are modified, they are simplified and manipulated. So we don't think if opposition wants to say that this is an integral part of their identity, it's not necessarily true. Because if the state wants to preserve this successfully, they have to simplify it, they have to like commodify it, they have to allow people they have to make like cartoons about it, and they have to allow people to speak it in simple forms. We don't think necessarily that is the same as the identity that you want to protect. But lastly, we would say that it reinforces conservatism. In a lot of situations, ladies and gentlemen, in order to preserve these languages, states will have to bring back older and more outdated scriptures or texts from olden days. And oftentimes these texts, especially if you look at Malaysian context, indigenous communities, a lot of their texts of these older languages are highly exclusive. They oftentimes otherize other communities, and this harms their ability to integrate. For all these reasons, we're happy to.
I tried to speak your voice quiet, sound like the Abhirup.
If a unified world is created as a result of oppression, privilege, and just oppressing minorities who just don't have representation, that is a unified world that is not preferable, because you force individuals to leave the culture that they once held true to their hearts, because the very definition of success is being white and abandoning your native languages. I'm going to do a few things in my speech. I'm going to give positive matter as well as first respond to the arguments that came the Prime Minister. The first thing that he told us that there is a stagnation. You will not be successful as a result of you abiding to your own language. The thing that he will say to this is that stagnation is the result of you constructing the world to be successful based on your definition of what a successful individual is. Therefore, you must speak English, you must dress in a certain way, and that is an unpreferable and horrible racist manner in which you construct success, and you further antagonize individuals by remaining complicit in the damages that you have previously caused as a result of that stagnation. So you are forcing individuals those failures as a result. Second of all, he told us that, oh, this is preferable because we have new languages that can spread out and we can do that in the first place. Here's the big harm to that. Your new languages that exist at point in time, so Malay exists right now at the expense of other languages being died out and being killed in of itself. So we don't think that's a preferable world. We think it's horrible in of itself because your creation of a new language results in the destruction of another language and the destruction of a culture that we think is unfair and unacceptable. Thirdly, he told us that, oh, we will simplify languages because as a consequence of deprioritizing these individuals, we don't think it will happen, right? We'll just make sure that every language is treated as equally as possible, and ensure that every single individual will have more cartoons and make sure every single person has access to the best possible language that we have. We will not deprioritize it. For that, you had a point, Maju. Okay, so let's move on to positive matter. What is opposition's world going to be like? We're going to stand for everything and all. We're going to stand for everything that we can possibly do to make it better for these individuals. We'll offer as many languages in public schools, we'll have internet classes, we'll have courses in degrees and subsidized universities for having more courses for these individuals, subsidized teachers to make it a profession that is profitable, so more people have access to this, or even change how we write documents in the government and the administrative office. So English isn't the only thing in which you write official letters as a state. You have other languages as well, which is inclusive as you possibly can. I'm going to tell you two things in my speech. First, I'm going to tell you why the state has a duty and responsibility to correct the mistakes and damages that have been caused by them because they were racist and bigoted in the past. Second of all, I'm going to tell you why the language in of itself is extremely important to the culture and the happiness that these minorities have, because you have taken everything that they possibly had from them. And thirdly, the comparative whether or not integration is a valuable part in this debate. First, let's look at why the state is complicit and responsible for this. The first thing the side opposition will say to this is that the state has the ostracized and discriminated Native Americans and minorities in the world today. The few things that they did, right? So the first thing that they did was that they colonized individuals, therefore they spread propaganda, that learning the language is a necessity that you have to have in order to be a successful individual. Your current language is holding you back. The second thing that they did was even more worse. They reduced the funding that they have to these schools. So Native American schools that exist in the world today are hardly funded. They have very little teachers. All the languages they have are nothing compared to what white American schools have, where there's so much more money in the beginning. We made it even worse for Native Americans when we reduced their access to the political spectrum by having voter ID laws that reduce their ability to vote, gerrymandering in states that don't have any political leverage in the world today, or creating a Congress in which very little individuals who are bigoted, racist Republicans have control over the money in which the state spends onto these individuals. So we think the structure in which we have created today has flawed Native Americans and minorities. I think that is a horrible, horrible world that the world that is created. So failure in which to change these problems means that the state is complicit in the damages that have been caused. I think that is a horrible world this side proposition chooses to propose. But before I move on to the second reason,
we're not disallowing people from speaking or practicing these languages. But don't you think for a Native American today who wants to integrate into mainstream American culture, it becomes a lot harder when the state compartmentalizes them and says, you're an Indian, you must speak.
So I'll respond to integration argument. But that's soft, right? If you want the world to be unified, you'd rather people just not speak that language anyways. You just want to say, oh, we'll let people speak, but we won't want them to be speaking it as much as possible. The second reason as to why it's even more was creation of Western values and the Western language in status quo. So to get a job in a white city, you have to give up the things that you had in your past. We will take away your children and put them in school because we felt that was necessary, in which we will make sure that you as an individual will become successful. And we think this is an untrue reality that they created. So it's perfectly reasonable and fair for a person to be successful based on his own heritage and culture. Right? Think about the oppression that your Native Americans face is a perfectly viable option. But the structure in which we have created and the glorification of Western values that we have put onto individuals has made it much harder and much less accessible. I think that world is horrible. I think that's problematic. So if we could have done it, we would have, right? So like how in Canada we ensure that all languages are spoken, like put French and English and all the Native American languages next to each other, it was administrative letters, we would have done it. But the reason as to why we don't is because we are racist and bigoted. The conclusion to this argument is that the state in of itself is complicit in the damages that have been done, and there is no justification for you to kill it because you've done something horrible in the past. Have a seat. Second of all, I'm going to tell you why the language in of itself is so important. So for a world where these individuals have faced years and years of ostracization, discrimination, and oppression, language is all they have. They have no comfort whatsoever because the world in which you structure how success is defined is not what they find happiness in. So they have to leave a lot of things, make a lot of sacrifices, and destroy cultures that they felt was once valuable to them. We think it is preferable that we give them some level of comfort and some level of happiness as opposed to the world in which we strip culture and respect to these individuals. And here's what happens, right? So when a world in which the life of minority is destroyed, we think we're easily complicit and damaged. We think that we should rather individuals have privacy to their thoughts and have access to those kinds of things. If it means that they can be more happier individuals in status quo, we don't think in a world in which we have these languages, we don't think it can be beneficial. The second thing they will say to this is the language in of itself has no relation to what Native Americans express for. So many words in the Native American language in of itself cannot be translated to English, and that in of itself is just reducing the abilities for Native Americans to oppress. Chippewa language that no relation whatsoever with the English language has failed in status quo. The last thing that we will say to this is that it's a cycle, and why is that damaging in the first place? In a world where we incentivize Asian languages, we are able to ensure that there's a career that you can make out of being a part of this culture and a part of this language, invest themselves into this. More people write books about this. We are incentivized into better usage of these languages. And what happens there? there are few things that will happen. The first thing that we will say is that we can ensure that the culture is less likely to die in the work proposition. But the second thing we will say is that we give these who are better able to challenge the structure in which we define success and we define happiness. So in a world where minorities have a stake, because it is a legitimate job right now to talk about Native American culture, Native American language, we're better able to fight the fight in a far better way. But the comparative of whether or not integration is preferable. Integration means nothing if your integration means that you have to fit to the national identity that was constructed by white bigoted presidents in the past. You're not integrating them, you're just blending them in and forcing them into a part of their world and a part of their life that is not preferable to them. So we rather as individuals, even maybe have less integration in our world as opposed to being forced into integration that is bigoted, racist, and forces individuals to abide or like destroy the culture that they once held dear to themselves. So we rather that comparative exists because not comparative in of itself is bigoted and racist.
And thank you. Now I can see the option. What even is the word anymore? Crop season.
Speaker will talk about two things. First of all, why there will be some degree of dilution even on the pipeline, because there is a market incentive for the majority to dilute these cultures to make them more accessible, which means a lot of your benefits in terms of these people being able to garner political will through their exclusion doesn't happen, because this can only, especially for a dying language, can only happen if you to a certain degree pander to that majority. Second of all, the need for states to be equidistant. Because what we want is for people to move away from this artificial construct that their happiness is dependent upon their identity. That can never happen in your paradigm, especially if there are far too many exclusive identities, and therefore the state needs to deprioritize or move away from public sphere the idea that identity is that crucial and not something which should be practiced. But before that, a few buttons on that idea of assimilation versus preservation and which one is better. First of all, is this the best way to help these minorities? Unfortunate as it was that in the past these people were discriminated against, we don't think that just a compensatory move in terms of allowing their culture to propagate in its most precise manner that tackles the political problems that they currently face, which means there's a huge mismatch between the problem that you identify and the solution that you propose in terms of these people using their culture. Which in fact it's far worse, because if the onus is going to be on the majority to reinterpret or to preserve this, and the state by your own characterization does come from that dominant white narrative, it's far more likely, in fact, that they will dilute it or mesh it in such ways that you can never use that as a political tool against them. But more importantly, people see this as tokenistic diversion of the political will for actual change, because we've done enough for these minorities when we allow them to propagate their own forms, their own norms of culture under our will and tutelage. The second idea was it's extremely crucial to their happiness. This is exactly what is regrettable, right? Because these people have internalized the idea that an identity which was oppressed in the past is the sole basis of their happiness. On our side, we are happy to use that funding for other things like giving you actual access to resources, which is the gap, which is why the Singapore model works, right? Because it actually changes the way these minorities behave themselves. It bridges the actual relative resource gap that exists between these places. Because a lot of the problems he talks about in terms of gerrymandering are political problems. The thing is this: when you have exclusion within these communities, when you have the idea that identity is extremely crucial and identity is something which is exclusive, can never be assimilated or can never be influenced. We can't interact with each other without recognizing the differences. In fact, the radical differences between us means that the political bridge between us is the political gap between us simply widens, because we always look at these people as the other and they look at us as the other. The benefit of a national identity is that although it might initially have possibly been formed along the lines of oppression or colonialism, the galvanization of anti-colonial sentiments which then interacted with this, and the idea that national identity is not as immutable as an ethnic, as a racial, as a language-based identity, Second of all, that it can often be far more cosmopolitan, is far more open to interpretation and interaction, means it's far better of a starting ground. We don't think any of these identities are perfect. We don't say national identities have been extremely good at integrating people. But we tell you they are far more likely to do that in the future as opposed to something which is not likely to change, which is likely to be based on things which people can't really evolve about themselves, which means we want to live in a world where people can choose or opt into identities that's far more easier with identities which aren't very immutable. Yeah.
So you also support removing individuals from indigenous cultures out of rural areas and putting them in cities because that's better for integration.
Yeah, I think we are perfectly okay with that. We are okay with forcing them, right? To the extent that these people hold their culture here, we will give them the option of propagating that. But we don't think the onus is on the state to keep them in those rural areas because we want to prioritize their exclusion. We want to say you can't have the option of possibly opting into a narrative if that's good for you, right? If it brings more money and brings better education, we think it's okay for these people. But the biggest area of commodification, right? First of all, let's understand this. When you talk about programs, you have to understand the nature of these programs and what it's likely to be. And if it's a dying language, then targeting. If it is a really dying language, for example, the language of Prakrit, which is preferred by the gens, right? For it to ever become something which is relevant to the majority, we have to prop up texts and reinterpret them in ways which mean that these identities or these languages are relevant to the dominant culture. The dominant culture can somehow associate with it. Given that the dissociation exists by virtue of their own characterization, we have to make people believe that, yeah, this is something I can opt into, and for that, there needs to be a significant dilution. A lot of the time, these minorities simply don't want that for themselves, right? Because what that means is they compromise on the pristineness of their culture, on the exclusivity of their culture, because the majority needs to understand it on their own terms. Why is this particularly bad, right? First of all, because obviously it doesn't maintain the purity of their culture. But second of all, it often makes these minorities look peculiar and different, right? Because if these languages are dying, you have to bring back texts from the past where these were possibly the dominant languages in society, which means you interpret them as the majority on the basis of texts which were possibly written 500 years ago and represent the state of that community in the past. What that often means is that you look at the norms or culture of that society, not in the way that it's possibly evolved over the next 500 years when the downward edge of that slope came out, right? On the declining end of that trend. But you look at them at their peak, but that peak often happened 500 or 600 years ago. The problem then is you look at them from the perspective of what they were historically, and that often means you look at them as more conservative or as more different or as having norms which can never be integrated into wider society. We think that's a particularly bad way of looking at these people and essentializing them, and it leads to multiple political problems in these areas. But why do we think the state then needs to be equidistant? A, because the idea that we want to preserve everyone's language, we want to preserve everyone's sentiments, is simply not feasible, right? For multiple reasons. A, because a lot of these languages necessarily came up at a time where there was more conflict, right? We didn't have civilized nations where people were antagonized to each other, But for example, in Sanskrit, we often have words for others, like for Muslim invaders known as barbaric tribes. That's necessarily the nature of those languages. Agree that there isn't a counter in the English language for that word, but we think that's a good thing oftentimes as opposed to a bad thing, because if you want to preserve it in its core essence, you have to preserve the exclusion of certain identity groups as the people you're fighting back against, because that was the spirit of the times. You can't say we want absolute purity and then say there won't be otherization of culture or exclusivity. Given that there is exclusivity, it's very hard for people to assimilate or integrate. Because if your sole motive, or if the political will or the political basis of preservation of these languages is going to be the fact that we think we were oppressed historically, people never move past the point of oppression and tackle problems today. They always look at it from the lens of the past and think that just because our grandfathers or their grandfathers were possibly oppressed, that's something that's legitimate. The other idea in terms of words not being modified enough, we think that there can be adaptation. For example, the word karma was integrated into English. We can pick up words and integrate them into English because we now are in fact the population majority of English-speaking people. We think all those things can be dealt with, but we want to prioritize identity.
It is not a construct from the past, neither is it artificial to say a person has gone through discrimination and will continue to go on with this discrimination, even though slavery ended 500 500 years ago. We say a culture does not translate into a person being represented for the past, but actually represents their current position in the world today, which is not very much different from 500 years ago when they were colonized and treated as barbaric individuals. Before I go to two questions, the first, whether or not the state has an obligation to do this, independent of what the outcomes are, whether we preserve it or not, and the second, what is better for these minorities, just a clarification, right? The first thing we will say is there is not an automatic need to simplify the language. The same way we taught Latin in courses and in schools, we can represent the culture as it was, maybe when it was at its height and then peak. So we say there's no need for us to dilute the value of it. But I'll tell you what the scale is. On a comparative, we'd rather a diluted language that exists than no language at all. So if you're telling me it's a simplified version, there's nothing to prove why it should not exist nonetheless. But the second thing he says, it must appeal to the majority. Well, we won't make it appeal to the majority. If it's a language that represents a culture, we represent it as accurately and as conservatively as you say it should be. The debate is not about how it's represented, but whether or not the state should actively represent that culture and that language in and of itself. So the first question, does the state have the obligation to do this? He said the government banks essentially said three things. The first, that this culture is unfair. It's an artificial construct that is based on discrimination in the past. The first thing we will say is, it is not an artificial construct. An identity of a person being based on the oppression, the colonial history, literally being butchered apart and torn apart as a family is not artificial. But the second thing we will say is, hasn't changed at all. Maybe we haven't never tortured Native Americans for a long time, but we haven't given them political rights. We've taken their families out of their ranches and relocated them. So the discrimination is not something of the past that you can easily let go of. But the third thing we will say is, you say these people should adopt a different identity. The state should say you should remove yourself from all identities. What a lie. The state is not taking a neutral stance. It's not saying everyone should have the same identity. It's saying you should have a Western identity, and that's how you become better. You should wear jeans, you should wear our clothes, you should adopt our culture and language. If you don't like our culture and language, then too bad, you should have no languages. So the debate is not a comparison between no identity versus a identity that is outdated. It's a comparison between a white identity and an identity that you were born with, and identity that oppression. So we say you're not defending a lack of identity, you're defending a racist identity. Have you seen? So we don't think it's artificial, we don't think it's transient. But the second thing he says is, it's important to have a national identity and a culture that is inclusive of everyone. Right. So we will say national identity is not an absolute lie, right? So they're based on artificial borders, on this and the colonial history we've had. So we entered countries like Philippines and we even indoctrinated the fact that Spanish culture is the best. National identity at best is a concept that's outdated and should not be forced onto them. And if a national identity is based on literally saying you should not have a right to represent Muslims in the past if they tortured you and you should call them barbaric as they were, then their history and their identity is lying to his culture every single day. It's telling you if a word in the English language cannot represent how you felt about Muslims in the past, you should not represent them as that way. If it means that you're representing them in a manner that is unfair, we will say it's still justified because the national identity was built on the suffering that these people had. But what identity do you want them to adopt? An identity that culturally appropriates, an identity that discriminates them and says you cannot wear the clothes that you want, adopt the culture that you have. What national identity is that? We say even if you're more inclusive, then inclusivity is not built upon empowerment and individual identity. It's based on blending. You're literally identifying and integrating because there's an asymmetry of power. We say the state, if anything, has an obligation to correct this wrong, independent of what the consequences are. Before I go to my second question, go ahead.
In order for America to protect and conserve the Native American culture, they've used Native Americans to work in casinos, they use Native American imagery to label sports teams. Are you happy with these forms of cultural appropriation?
That's cultural appropriation, and we obviously are against that because you're using the culture to represent a majority. But the teaching of a culture in school is literally teaching the way in which they represent their identity. It is absolutely different. But the second question, what is better for minorities? The simple bullet on the government team was, as long as we integrate them, there is a world that is better. Here are 4 reasons why you will integrate them. The first, a world in which minorities do not view themselves as equal. At best, you have individuals who internalize the how. So they internalize that they're secondary, they internalize that maybe they're subservient, and that's a world in which they're not integrated, they're barely blending in. But the second thing we will say, often as minorities get really antagonized, right? They end up hating the majority, they live in enclaves because they don't feel empowered, they feel oppressed. To which we say the comparative is an integration based on identities that are equal. So a world in which more people buy into the Native American language, children in schools who are Native American end up opting to this language, then there's a market People end up teaching the language to their children. Maybe more movies will be created by Native American authors and directors. It's a world in which they will feel that they are more equal to their white counterparts. And that is a world in which they are more likely to tolerate, less likely to see white people as vilifying horrible individuals who have whitewashed them. But the comparison is this. We would rather, in our worst case scenario, a lack of integration and exclusivity to this culture if that means it represents the way they feel about themselves and the way they feel about those communities. Because you don't put that integration in and of itself is a benefit. Because the integration that exists right now is a result of constructing our happiness around white people. Constructing our happiness around speaking the native, not speaking the native language, speaking white people's languages. If we can change that system and literally make the language of a Native American more inclusive for more people by making it a product of our state, making it part of official languages, and it's a world in which maybe there will be less integration, but people will be happier in and of themselves. But the final comparison is that which side gets a better integration? Apparently to the DPM, we need to manage funds properly. And the integration can only exist through programs and all these benefits that we think are important to the state. So actual programs. Right, so that's not mutually exclusive. We can also have all those programs that help Native Americans integrate if we wanted to. But here's the comparative. All those programs are whitewashed. You're literally going to integrate them by saying you should wear and adopt the culture of a white society in order for them to be better. So the comparative is funds that go into that type of management and that type of integration. We'd rather the funds not go there and we'd rather the funds go into a language. It's not enough for you to say the identity is a transient identity. There is an identity that they say you just remain neutral about it. Because the world is not neutral about whether or not Native Americans are discriminated. They literally have lied to their children, they lied to their white daughters and white sons. So we see the comparative is maybe less integration, but a world which represent their pain and suffering more integration.
I thank the speaker for my speech. Now invite the last women speaker to Yeah. We have a platform.
Ready?
Yeah.
All right. It's just, we think the burden that OP has taken upon itself today has been too huge, because if they accept our differences and if they say they're propping up all culture but just by funding languages, they need to prove necessarily how the change the change in political will or how the political landscape within these countries will change to the point where we're suddenly going to have a change in terms of definition. We don't think that was the burden they're supposed to take on themselves, and they dug a hole for themselves, right? And we think that's problematic, because we tell you what OP has told you today is that the word is regrettable. It's regrettable the word is what worked up until now. We tell you, but reality is that often certain ideas have percolated down in society a certain way, because maybe the Western ideal powers were more strong than Eastern powers in historical times. We tell you what has happened though is not that everything has suddenly become whitewashed white society. We tell you it's been a dual transaction in terms of both cultures learning from each other and appropriating each other and mutating to become more inclusive. We tell you Malaysia isn't the same as the USA. India is very different from the USA. It's very different from England, and they have even though the ideas of success may lead to similar places, we tell you the means in which the people can achieve this sort of success are often very different, because they have their own cultural notions of how this success can be achieved. Which means in India, you often have karmic nirvana in terms of how you can be successful in having life. It doesn't need to be just about money and all those things. And I don't think that's even a burden we need to take upon ourselves today, because we tell you the idea in itself is too quixotic. We tell you they live in a world where they don't understand that they're talking about a language that is overwhelmingly a minority. We're not talking about things like the Native American language, because we don't think it's dying out. But even if we take that idea, let's talk about how state intervention, and this is where the debate was most important, and we think they missed the bus, right? Because what happens is when the state intervenes, it sets, it enshrines certain values which even the culture that they're enshrining can't change in time. Which means what's now going to happen, it sets standards or particular boxes. So you need to take to be a Native American, which means you need to have feathers on your head to be Native American, or you need to dress a certain way to be Native American. We think that on a global scale or even on a national scale, this sets certain preconceived notions and stereotypes in terms of romanticizing the idea of a Native American, or say, let's take actual minorities, people that Rafiq and Sahar spoke about, people that we spoke about in terms of Jain cultures or minority cultures within Indonesia and polyethnic societies. We tell you this makes it harder for both the majority and the minority, because the majority now has a set idea about what the minority looks like, which means the minority can never say that I am a modern minority. I'm someone who has adapted to the change and evolved with time, and you need to accept me the way I am. Like we tell you, this becomes harder and harder for people, and this misinterpretation of their culture sets archaic boundaries on what it means to be a minority within these societies. We tell you identities become static in nature, and that is particularly harmful, because let's understand why state intervention in this case is not a good thing. We tell you, where does state intervention happen? It happens when broad society or everybody is affected equally by it. But we tell you, in our case, when the minority needs to be preserved, they have taken the idea that they won't make it popular, they won't allow it to mutate, they'll preserve every language purely. We tell you that just can't happen, because at the end of the day, you are going to be pandering to the majority of the society, a society where you'll have to make, like, McDonald's have boards in certain languages, and we think those kind of new moves just don't work. On the counter, we have told you things like providing them actual tangible assets to be able to do whatever they want is the best way to do this. Because we tell you, wages and schools can be funded regardless. If these people want to teach their languages, they will do so anyway. They're not going to incentivize them more by saying that if you teach this language in this way, using these standards, this grammar, this dialect, this is going to benefit you more. We tell you, in South India, this is particularly important, because often they have very differing dialects across the 4 states that make up South India in terms of Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, and Kerala. But these languages have mutated to adapt to each other because it's beneficial economically for these states to interact with each other. And we tell you, this might become a problem, because now we are enshrining regional values or regional nationalistic values, and that makes it harder. It creates divides across regions where there needs to be no line, where it would be beneficial for everyone to interact with each other, and we think that's particularly problematic. But we tell you, the biggest problem with the op today has been that there has been a drastic problem solution mismatch, right? Because they want to change the way people dress, because they want to change the idea of success, they want to talk about how changes happen in terms of cultures and definitions, but they don't tell us how their means are necessarily going to attain the end, right? We tell you, it's regrettable that the means we have used until today have been the way they are, but we tell you the end has been good. And we tell you, outcomes play an important role in choosing or deciding whether state intervention will work or not. It doesn't work on idealism. It has to also take pragmatism into play, right? And that is why it's so important that side of we understood today. Before I move on, yes.
Appreciate race stereotype you just mentioned is a product of status quo and whitewashing. How is y'all going to correct that? You don't empower the language as a representation of the culture. It is most accurate form.
The first problem we have with your solution is that language isn't the way to do it. We think people should be given resources to choose to do whatever they want. And we tell you, if they choose to integrate, we can't tell them that it's necessarily a bad thing. We are no one to tell them that cultural dilution is a bad thing. In fact, we think us choosing how it happens is worse than them choosing themselves if they want to dilute their culture or not. We don't think the state can set standards on how to adapt or evolve in terms of your culture, right? But also in terms of how, what is the value of culture, right? We don't think culture is important for the sake of culture. We think there is a certain amount of solidarity, and it gives meaning to community. If the same meaning can be found in this whitewashed world, at worst, we're still fine with it. But in the best case, we think
both cultures interact with each other equally, which means often cultures at a micro level, a broader spectrum at a regional level, and then grow into a broader level, thing at a national level. We think, which is why it's largely unbelievable the case that's come out from side of, because we think they haven't proven how this political change will happen, and because they've proven to you legitimate harms in terms of hurting communities and setting standards, and for all these reasons, we're very, very proud. Thank you.
The only people that create and perpetuate negative stereotypes about minorities are the individuals that through their policies tell their people, you were right to say that their cultures were less than ours, you were right to disenfranchise them, because we're doing the same thing too. We are going to weed out all of the culture, because obviously the culture of the majority is what is most important and is what is necessary for national integration, right? I'll discuss three things in my speech today. First of all, just a very quick talk about whether or not it's effective in terms of preserving language, right? Whether it achieves the things that we want. Second, I'll talk about the responsibility of the government, what it is that they need to achieve. And last, I'll talk about unity and integration, the things they try to argue, right? So we told you that what would be effective is teaching these languages, preserving them as much as possible, right? So meaning that they will be able to access governmental things. So if they want to vote, they don't have to go there and be confused by the languages that are put there, because we will have integrated those things there, right? We talked about making sure that in public school, or just for any school that you want to access, you will have the option of being able to learn those languages. What did they tell us? The first thing they said was that it was useless. Give them resources instead. I'm assuming they need money, right? But there's two things we say, right? First, no use having money when the governmental structures that you have placed mean that they cannot vote. Your racist voter ID laws mean that they have no political representation in Congress, right? Being able to have a language at least that allows them to access those things more, being able to make sure that their language is more accessible for the wide majority, for wherever it is that they go, at least make sure that they feel a sense of comfort when they go into the rest of the world, right? Because you say that them needing to be able to learn the majority language doesn't mean that they necessarily will. It doesn't mean that you haven't, it doesn't mean that you embrace their identity as such, right? But more than that, what did they tell us? They told us that it only leads to a dilution of those languages, right? Because the majority is the one that decides those things. And this is why it's so important that we need to preserve those languages, right? Because it means that we're more likely then to employ minorities that do have a command of those languages that can give us the things, right? And that's why your whitewashing of those languages is a lot less likely. The whitewashing, however, of Native American cultures happens when you do not include them, but it happens when you make sure that they never are able to access the structures that we place, and that's why we think it's most effective to not adulterate language right now and keep it as such. No, thank you. Let's then talk about this second idea in terms of what the government is responsible about. There's a clash here, right? So we think that we have a responsibility to run accessibility on whatever it is that these people feel is most comfortable to them. They say that accessibility needs to come from the identity of the majority. Let's discuss this, right? Because what we told you is that they have a responsibility because they are the oppressive state, right? They are the state that has coerced all stratas of society into assimilating the majority identities. They tell us a few things. No, thank you. They tell us that appropriation occurs from all communities. Everyone learns from each other. We create a unified identity as such, right? But the difference is this. Your appropriation from all communities has only benefited the majority. This means that your Native Americans are still no closer to getting jobs just because you tell them that they need to learn English. It also means that they're no closer to becoming a part of parliament because you have established that not only is their language subpar, them as people and as their culture is subpar as a result of that, right? We think that this idea of appropriation, everyone does it, therefore it's okay, is also flawed, right? Because it's not appropriation. No, thank you. When a Native American woman has to take off her tribal clothing and has to wear your suit and tie and skirt because that's just what it takes to be successful, right? So in that sense, then we don't think it's appropriation. We think that you force them into those things, and we think that it's unnecessary. And those are things that we need to fix, right, in our work today. Yes.
Ma'am, we're not defending discrimination or voter ID laws, or not even allowing people to practice their cultures. This debate is about whether or not state intervention does lead to this. Don't you think it otherwise those communities and puts them in boxes that they can't escape from?
The thing is, the only time that these minorities are otherwise is when you take out their languages, right? The things that make them themselves, the things that they hold dear to their cultures, the things that they are born with and they are told that is important as a part of them, right? Because those are certain words that represent the struggles that they went through, and they have certain words that deal with the oppression that they had to culturally, historically deal with, right? So if you take out those languages, if you tell them that you need the culture of the majority in order to be a part of our world, the only other thing will be the thing that they feel within themselves, right? Recognizing that they're not being accepted into society, but instead recognizing that they're just having to play the role, right? Play the role of the white man, play the role of the white woman, because that's what brings you so-called integration, right? Ultimately, we think that the government has a greater responsibility than simply spending efficiently, right? Because if you think that it's expensive to start these classes, then we suggest that we increase taxation, right, on the rich individuals who have profited off of the natives' land and the native suffering and blood, right? So if it's so expensive, then that's what we think that we should do. We have a responsibility to deal with the sins that we've committed against them, right? Let's talk about this last idea in terms of unity and integration in dealing with the idea of otherness, right? But here's the thing, right? In response to talking about this, we told you that reading out that language means that you have a false form of integration or no integration at worst, right? Their example was that, no, but a lot of different countries have done this, right? Their example was Singapore, right? Because the national identity is amazing and you've got, everyone being together. But the problem is that their national identity, having to unify everyone, has only perpetuated the exclusion of Malays, of non-Chinese individuals, right? Because having to make everyone a part of the majority means that, however, as much as you try, minorities will still want to hold on to what is there, right? Because they have spent so many hundreds of years to preserve those things, not going to just let go of those things. And why is it important then to recognize this? When they value those things, right? When you try and shut them out of those things, when you say that if you want to send your child to a public school, we're not going to help you teach them those languages, they're like to isolate themselves from their world, right? That does not want to accommodate them. And that's even more harmful for them in the long term, right? When they aren't able to access political structures, when they aren't able to access education because they feel that it's going to adulterate their child, right? If your political structures can accommodate the language of the majority and not the minorities on whose land you reap your profits and luxury, we don't think that integration is something that is going to happen, right? But let's just talk about this from the lens of this individual who is a minority, a Native American, right? This is a language that they have held dear to themselves. It's a language that they feel comfortable. And the reason why they feel comfortable speaking in it is because it's a culture that they taught. So this means when they speak with their family, when they're around individuals who they feel oppress them, there are some kind of solitude that they can look to feel comfortable, to not feel like they're being judged as they speak those things, right? To have the state actively try to stand those things out and tell them that the only language you should be speaking is one of the majority means that you take away that safe space. It means that you do not allow them anymore to have those private conversations that they need. It means that you don't allow them anymore to be able to feel a connection to their children, a feel a connection to their forefathers, right? That fought for their ability to stay in those areas. And why is that so important? Because ultimately, right, if you want minorities to be able to succeed in this world, it's not going to happen just by telling them to fit into the stereotype of what a white man should be. It will only happen when you are able to feel as if you are comfortable in yourself, and that's when you can be most empowered to do great things. The side of government obviously doesn't stand for voter ID laws that increase discrimination, cultural appropriation, and racism in this world. But what you do when you say a culture and a language, and something people find solace in should die, is literally saying a culture that is dominant is more important than another. The point at which you say a culture is less valuable, you will literally legitimize all the reasons why we should appropriate them, why we should pick and choose which parts of Native American culture we want to take, pick and choose which part of yoga we want to integrate, and what part of the Kama Sutra we think is important. Because you know what? We pick and choose based on what's convenient, not based on what is representative, not based on what we think a culture should. So we say if it's true, the word interacts equally well, the appropriation is just horrible and misrepresents that entity. So I have two questions to ask. The first, is this a state obligation? And the second, whether or not the lives of minorities will be better. I explain the first one because since you're so important to the side of the government. Apparently, we cannot put people in boxes. Because if we do, there will be less integration, life will be less meaningful. We will say you have literally missed the boat. If integration makes life more meaningful, then you win that argument. We disprove this on two levels. The first, we say that integration is a result of internalization and a lack of empowerment. So the and they do this as a result of believing that they're secondary. So that integration doesn't mean they feel better about themselves, it also doesn't mean that they feel better about their majority. Which means you don't prove the link between integration and life being better for these individuals, even if I believe they can actually integrate. But the second thing we will say is, they want to empower choice. Apparently, according to the whip, we must empower their choice. Who asked you to make them wear their headgear that you explain so racistly, right? They never had a choice. It's their option choice, Mr. Speaker. They never chose to be the identity. You have literally coerced them into picking identity because opting out of a Western culture means they'll be victimized, vilified, and cut off as secondary. So don't tell me you're defending choice, because if some Native Americans try to opt into the Western culture, you should allow them to. You never give them the choice to pick. You should at least allow a better access to this language. So if anything in our world, if they want to opt out of their culture, they're in a better position to do so, because both are equally empowered and both are equally strong. But the third thing they say integration is important is because everyone interacts equally. What a lie, Mr. Speaker. Cultures don't interact equally. The Redskins, it's called the Redskins because we decided it's going to be a Redskin, but they never talk about the discrimination they face. A Native American sing that will probably feel horrible about the way his culture is appropriated. Because you know why? They don't understand their language, they don't understand the way that they're suffering. Obviously, we can't change the world, but if we can give them one more place of solace, one more place where their culture is appreciated in schools, in courses, that is a world in which they will feel better about themselves. Maybe they won't integrate as much, but we would rather not integrate with the white racist community that exists and find solace in our language. Because you might say language is not all that important, but if it's one more word that represents the white people in an accurate manner, if it's one more culture in which I can curse at the white people, that's one more culture that is a solace. We will give few more people because we make it a culture that's more accessible. So the comparative in this debate is not integration and a better life versus culture and only a culture. It is a world in which there's more comfort versus less integration with a racist, horrible, complicit. So we say you don't make lives better, we went there comparing. But the second thing which they have done little to none in this debate is explain responsibility. The closest they came to this debate was telling me there's a national identity that we should all adopt into. Great. If that identity is built on the suffering and pain of other individuals, refuses to recognize all the suffering that exists in the world, refuses to recognize specific words like Buddhistic show, which says white people kill and butcher out our Native American individuals, then their culture and identity is not worth defending. If anything, the state has been complicit in the suffering. Money can't change that. You give them money, what is the point? You have to put money into a racist state that funds the racism and makes things worse. If we can't correct the world around them, we can at least give them a place of solace that is not dying out in this world. That's the comparative they lost out in the debate. Because even if it's diluted, even if it's controlled by the majority, the comparison is none in your world. The comparison is less Native Americans having access to that in school, than in courses, having access to it, to make it a viable business maybe, to make it a viable option to stick into. It's not viable in your world. There's no choice in your world. And there is a world in which the state not only complicit in saying money is the solution to everything, but literally saying with that money comes an absolution of all the guilt that we have done in this world. So we say even if we don't get integration, and even if the lives of the people would be better under this community, it is definitely an obligation to be more accessible and pump money into this. Because the comparative is pumping money into assets that you don't even know they can materialize, will probably be put into a racist state, or be probably put into making appropriation of cultures worse. We would rather put that money into a culture that gives them a comfort zone. That's the comparative in this debate.
I thank the speaker for speech. Now, last speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to conduct my reply by looking at the burdens the opposition wants to take, burdens we want to take, and which side fulfill those burdens. Let me start with opposition, because they're the most interesting in this debate. The opposition team in this debate wanted to take up the burden to say that by preserving dying languages, we get to somehow fight racist voter ID laws, we somehow depose colonialism in all its forms, somehow we on inside government have to defend forced relocation of minorities, the whitewashing, education, and the media. So everything on the opposition side, or the value opposition, minorities, rights, and freedoms to fight those structures. That is not mutually exclusive in this debate. We said we support welfare, we support anti-discrimination laws, and that's fine. As a matter of fact, saving money from these preservation programs and putting that money into welfare will increase the benefits and those rights of those minorities. This debate is not about helping minorities, we agree. This debate was fundamentally about preserving dying languages. That was their burden to show how that policy would solve all those problems, and they never did so. The second assumption the opposition made was that somehow these minorities want these cultures to be preserved. We said sometimes that may be true, but we said in many cases, these minority groups and these communities actually want to move away from those cultures and to realign into mainstream society. They said that that's wrong because mainstream social construct of colonialism and white people, fine. But the point is this. Given that we have a history of historical ethnic tensions and ethnic divides, what is the best way in which we can solve those problems? This debate happens from the lens of the state, not from the lens of the minority groups. If the minority groups want to preserve their culture and practice their language, that's their right. This debate is about whether it would be best if the state takes upon the action to preserve those cultures, ladies and gentlemen. So what did we say on site government? When do languages die? We said languages die when communities modernize, when languages die and form new languages and new identities. We spoke about the Malay language and how it's a concoction of Chinese and Polynesian languages, ladies and gentlemen. We said it leads to the formation of new identities. We also said what happens when you preserve cultures, and this is something they refuse to engage on because at the end of the day, their value proposition was they'll have some happiness. Fine, we accept. Maybe preserving the dying language will have some happiness for some individuals, but let's compare the scale of these benefits. First, we said it otherizes communities. We said there is a slippery slope when states decide and take it upon themselves to preserve cultures. Because states have to be populist, they have to be popular, they have to make it fun enough for more people to support the programs. What does this lead to? It leads to the compartmentalization of these ethnic groups. We said it romanticizes the past, so it locks people into boxes that they can't escape from. On our model, they can still escape from those things. If you want to be Native Indian, you can choose to speak Native American languages, or you can choose to speak English. That's not something we would enforce. On your side, there is an expectation that they should be able to speak these languages. So this leads to that romanticization. So that means the state will commodify these cultures. That's why every time someone meets an indigenous in Malaysia, they'll ask, oh, can you speak your indigenous language? That's exactly the forms of otherizations that happen in this world. Secondly, we told you that what happens is oftentimes this will lead to the revisiting of all archaic texts and archaic moralities, ladies and gentlemen. Oftentimes, in my second speaker speech, I talked to you about the Sanskrit language and how it tends to otherize and exclude other cultures. By revisiting these texts and these cultures and these archaic norms, it makes those things the norms. So when you learn the Native American language and you see the names that they call the white colonizers or everyone else, then there is this expectation that they are other from us, and it makes it harder for us to integrate with each other, ladies and gentlemen. We also said in my second speaker's speech, in a fantastic argument, he said, if you are saying that solving or preserving languages will solve all these problems, that's exactly the narrative the state will use. The state will use this as a token gesture to say that we preserve your language, we don't have to help you anymore because you're expected to integrate. So in the end, the trade-off is this. We might have some happiness, some people might have a slightly bigger sense of identity, but on a larger scale, they are becoming otherized, they'll have expectations pushed onto them. On our side, they can still practice their cultures, they can still have that control, they'll have more control and more freedom and to opt in or opt out of that. But it is on our side, everyone can form their own identities and whatever identities is most broad. And on our side, we have better integration. Thank you.
I'd like to hear the speakers. Please go forward, great hands, and wait outside.